Okay, so I'm going to start us off with a few quotes. Love all, trust a few, do wrong to none. Anybody hear that before or have a guess of who said it? Okay, William Shakespeare. Should do like a trivia up on the screen. Whoever is careless with the truth in small matters cannot be trusted with important matters. Oh, I should have done it like Bible or someone else, but it's somebody else. Albert Einstein. So trust is something I think that comes up quite a bit, when it comes to relationships and what it means to, kind of be vulnerable and your true self, right? I think often when we don't trust somebody, there's always a part of us that we're going to like hold back. And I tend to trust people pretty easily, but even in saying that, like for many, many, many years, there was always still like something that I couldn't fully be me, right? So actually, when you look at the Greek behind the word hypocrite, it actually means like masks. So we always think hypocrite means you say one thing but you do another, right? And that is a definition of hypocrite. But it's this idea that like almost being like a chameleon, right? Like I can entrust this part of myself to this person, but I can't with this person. So I'll hold that back, but maybe I can trust them with this, but not, you know what I'm saying? Like, and that's a part of genuinely just getting to know people. Is this a safe person for me, right? We hear that word quite a lot. We want to create safe spaces and we want to be safe people. Like I said, I kind of by default trust pretty easily. But as I've gotten older, I am a little bit more cautious of how quickly I disclose things. And sometimes, too, because I'm an internal processor, if I don't have the time when I'm getting to know somebody or like we're communicating, if I don't have that time to like think about what I'm about to say, like, and I say it, it's not always the right thing to say, at that time with that person. And so I'm sure we've all had experiences, right, where we thought we could trust somebody and then they are not as trustworthy as we thought. Or sometimes there's people that are a little bit more cold, like on the front end, and so we think, oh, that's not a trustworthy person. But then as you get to know them, you're like, oh wow, like there is like a vulnerability here that I can have with this person, even though maybe at first they didn't feel quite as warm to me, or. So the trust of the innocent is the liar's most useful tool. So that's Stephen King, right? So what he's saying is that if you trust quickly, the people that are not trustworthy are going to be attracted to you, right? Because they're going to see something in you that that they can use for their own advantage, right? As a liar is how he worded it here. But the person who isn't trustworthy, again, we'll find that person who trusts easily so that they can use them or manipulate them. Because sometimes when you trust easily, you come off with this air of like naivety, right? So again, if there's somebody who wants to use you for their own purposes, they'll be attracted to you. So we know that trust is important, right? But it's hard to trust. It's hard to know who can I be vulnerable with? Who can I put my trust into, right? And then who can I trust? So I'm curious, and you guys know I love my scales of 1 to 10. So I'm just curious, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I don't trust quickly at all, and 10 being like in the moment, on a scale of 1 to 10, how quickly do you trust people?
I think it depends on the situation.
Okay.
That's where the numbers would be.
Okay. And can you give me a scenario maybe where you would trust quicker?
Probably trust quicker with friends or someone
Yep.
who you know.
Right.
And those people that you don't know,
Mm-hmm.
you may not be as trusting at first until you get to know them better.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. What would be the characteristics of somebody you would trust quickly or quicker? Dependability. Yeah. For sure. Integrity is huge for me. Like, And it's not, for me too, like integrity is not always that you do the right thing all the time, but that you own up, when you do mess up. And then I think that helps, because I think we've all had experiences where we trust somebody, they mess up somehow, right? The trust then gets taken away. But I think if somebody is, seeking forgiveness or owning up to what they did wrong, then the trust can be rebuilt a little quicker than if they don't acknowledge, right, that there's something that they did that made you pull back on how much you trust them. Anybody else want to share? Would you say, as life has lived out, like you've found it harder to trust, or yeah? And then every once in a while you hear stories like, oh, I met this person, it restored my trust in humanity, like, because there are people that are trustworthy, but. All right, so we're in John chapter 20, 24 to 25. But Thomas, called Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were telling him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, if I don't see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will never believe. So this idea of never believing, it actually comes from the Greek word I will believe, right? And when you look behind that, it actually means accept. So what Thomas is saying is, I will never accept that Jesus has resurrected, that he's alive and with us again, until I see him, until I put my hand in his side, I see the holes in his hands, because I don't know what has happened in Thomas's life, but I mean, the resurrection is a pretty hard thing to believe, I think. Like, they've seen Jesus, they've seen him do his miracles. He's been proving to them along the way that he's a trustworthy person and God, but there's something in Thomas that he's just like, no, like I need a little bit more proof before I believe this. And I was scrolling on Facebook, and there was cookies for Easter that had like jam in the middle of the hand, and they were like Resurrection Sunday cookies, and I'm like, I don't think I would want to eat that. But 2,000 years later, the fact that Jesus died on the cross, and the account of what he did, and the fact that it is true, right, is the linchpin of our faith. And if it isn't, then they say if the resurrection didn't happen, everything that we believe just crumbles and falls apart, right? So we see Thomas saying, no, until I know for sure that Jesus has risen, I cannot accept this. Like, it's just not going to be the trajectory of my future until Jesus proves himself. So he needs to evaluate the situation, right? He's not going to take secondhand information. He's saying, I want firsthand information. And I don't know if you remember, a couple weeks ago, I preached about this idea that we do need firsthand knowledge, right, of Jesus and how he wants to be a part of our life, right? If we're only ever hearing, oh, Jesus did this for me, oh, Jesus did this for me, that's not really going to sustain our faith, right? Like, we need encounters with him for us personally, and that's okay, because the firsthand information is the thing that keeps us going, right? As we doubt, as we face hardship, I mean, there's just those anchor moments, you know what I mean, that you can go back to, so that when you're in the current present moment and you're like, I don't know if I accept this truth anymore, then you can go back to those anchor moments, right, of the past that say, okay, maybe when I need to borrow faith a little bit, but I've had these experiences with Jesus, right? So for me, a lot of those like doubts came up when we were in Boston and what was happening with the coffee shop, and I was just like, shouldn't this all be working, right? If Jesus told me to do this, but then I could go back and I could see, okay, there's been other instances in my life where I thought it would go one way, but it didn't, but I saw God in it, right? So even though things aren't always going the way that we want them to, when we have these firsthand experiences with God, it solidifies, right, who he is in our lives. So, I'm sure we all have heard Thomas called Doubting Thomas, right? And he kind of gets this bad rep, right? Like, oh, all the 12 or the other 11 disciples, they believed, but then there was that doubting Thomas, right? And he gets this bad rep. But if you read Proverbs 14:15, it says, the inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. So again, it's this idea that, Evan, can you put that up on the screen? It's this idea, right, that Proverbs 14:15. Yeah. So this idea again, like when you're naivety, when you're naive, you just kind of execute without thinking about it. But what this proverb is saying is that the sensible one, the one that kind of slows down and takes their time, watches their steps, right? So maybe instead of jumping all the way to step 12 on something, you say, well, what's the right next step? And then you take that step. And then you reevaluate, right? And then you keep going from there. And what we see is that when Thomas says, I need to know if this is real, like I need to see Jesus' hands, his side, we see that Jesus does that for him, right? Like when Thomas says, I need this in order to believe, Jesus responds. And it says, so the disciples rejoice. So what Thomas is asking for is not that crazy, because if you look further back into chapter 20, Jesus does this for the other disciples that were present at the time, right? And he goes, and they are excited because they have seen Jesus again. But Thomas, because he hasn't yet seen Jesus, is still in that place of grief, right? So we talk a lot, well, not a lot, but during that Easter, right, there's the Silent Saturday. And, we do our Good Friday gatherings, we do our Resurrection Sunday, Easter Sunday gatherings, but we often forget about Saturday, right? This in-between place that the disciples would have been in, because their Messiah is dead, right? And he has said to them, I have to go through this, I have to do it. But, again, they're in this tension place of, is what he said he's going to do, is it going to actually happen, right? And so Thomas is kind of still in that silent Saturday, right? The resurrection's happened, but he hasn't seen Jesus yet. So he's still trying to figure out, how is this going to go down? John 20:26-27 says, a week later, his disciples were indoors and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. So one of the things I love about Jesus is that he has this non-anxious presence, right? Like he calms the storms. He's all about peace, right? He said twice now to the disciples, peace be with you, right? And when there's peace, there's a lack, at least, of anxiety, right? So Jesus has this great non-anxious presence, and he knew that Thomas wanted proof. Again, that's fine, but yet he waited a whole week, right? So for me, if I'm discipling somebody and they want proof of something when it comes to following Jesus, I'm not always a non-anxious presence about that, there's a part of us that want to make sure people understand and have proof that God is real and this is how he operates in the world and with us, right? So if somebody texts me and they're like, oh, I have this question, I'm responding right away. As soon as I see it, I'm going to write back. But again, Jesus knew all this time that Thomas wasn't present for his first appearance, and he would know that Thomas was, struggling with belief and accepting the truth, but he waits a week. And I think that's kind of just an aside thing, but again, Jesus is not panicked about people believing whether he's God or not. He's not anxious about saying the right things in the right place at the right time for, it to all come together perfectly. He knows he can be present wherever and whenever he wants to be, right? And he also knows the right timing. And he invites Thomas to receive that proof that he needs, right? And I think I don't hear it quite as much now, but there was a season, I think, in the church where, like, if you doubted, it meant, like, oh no, you're on this slippery slope and you're, like, about to start worshiping the devil, and, and so people wouldn't bring their doubts, they wouldn't bring them up. And what we're seeing here in this scripture is that Jesus honors Thomas's doubt, right? Like, he honors him and gives him the proof that he needs. And I think this shows us, and this is kind of the main thing I want us to take out of the scripture today, is that Jesus is willing to always prove that he's trustworthy, right? That's, I think, always his goal for when he interacts with people, is that he wants to show that he is somebody that we can put our trust into, right? And not just this like willy-nilly belief, but he says, no, like, come touch my hands, come poke my side, like, you can get right in there with him and be intimate, and he will prove that he's trustworthy. And he says, don't be faithless. And we know faithless means a lack of trust, or belief and trust. So it's, if we're not pursuing the truth, right, then we'll never trust, right? Truth has to come before trust. And he says, don't be faithless, but believe. So then belief was obviously the opposite of faithless, belief, trust, but also, like, it takes it a step further with the Greek, and it means reliance. So Jesus doesn't want us just to believe and trust him. He wants to know that he is reliable. We can rely on him when we need him. And when you go back to this idea of believe, the most often sense in the Greek actually means affection or allegiance, right? So this is a trust that gives us kind of that assurance that we are meant to give Jesus all the praise, honor, glory he's due, right? The affection. And that because we profess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in our hearts God raised him from the dead, we have made this oath, right? We've made this covenant to be allegiance, to have an alignment with Jesus. John 20:21 says, Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you. So what we're seeing is, yes, we're being called to a mission, right? And we're called to align ourselves with Jesus and this mission that he has for us. And the allegiance that we have for him has to come from a place of trust, right? You can't say, like, I'm hitching my wagon to this horse, to this Jesus, if you don't trust that they're the right person to hitch your wagon to, right? Like, you have to have this level of trust before you can give that kind of devotion that he's looking for. And then we see that Thomas makes this pledge of allegiance. In John 20:28, he says, Thomas responded to him, my Lord and my God. Right? So up until this point, Jesus has most often been referred to as rabbi. What does rabbi mean? Teacher, right? So they knew he was this man of knowledge, right? And even the first time he preached, when it's recorded in the book of Mark, they say, who is this man that has this knowledge, that has this insight, that has this authority, right? So they, all this time, have known Jesus as teacher. He's taught them great things. But what Thomas now is saying, he's taking it to the next level. Jesus will continue to be teacher, but not only is he teacher, he's God and Lord. And Thomas is one of the first to make that profession, right? And so when you make that profession, when you believe in your heart, or when you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you're making that statement of allegiance, right? You're saying, this is my God. This is who I'm putting all my eggs in this basket. That this is the creator God who created the world, created me, and wants relationship with me, and I'm going to allow him to have that power and authority in my life. So you're aligning yourself with God when you make these professions. And then Jesus gives an encouragement to Thomas and to us. In John 20:29, Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. So what's cool about this is, I mean, Thomas, sometimes we take that statement and we put it right back to Thomas and say, oh, well, if you hadn't seen Jesus, but then, and still believed about his resurrection, then you'd be blessed. You'd be better off. But that's not what this verse is saying. It's saying, you know, those who actually saw Jesus on earth, experienced his life, death, resurrection, ascension, like they have a really good reason to believe, right? And even if you look at other writings from that time of people that didn't profess that Jesus was Lord, but they did talk about Jesus a lot, right? Like there's writings from different people in that stage of life where like they're talking about this Jesus who's doing these miracles and these different things. So they call it extra biblical proof. So there are people, you know, we have the biblical recounts, but there are also recounts of what Jesus did from people that didn't even believe and follow him. So there is, you know, this eyewitness proof that Jesus was real and he did what he said he was doing. But he says, okay, so that's great for those who have been present physically at that time, but blessed are those, so that is us, who have not seen him in his physical form, yet still believe, right? So, but that doesn't mean that he's not going to answer those doubts that we have. That doesn't mean that he's not going to reveal himself in some really specific and interesting ways to us as we ask him for that, right? Like, when I was at Kingswood, you know, especially third, fourth year, students are starting to get pretty panicked about their futures. Like, they're trying to decide, okay, yeah, I came here, I did this, but what's next? And you know, there's some really cool stories about how people have sought Jesus for their future. You know, I'm sure you know this concept of like laying out a fleece and praying very specifically, like, oh God, if you want me to do this, then, you know, I need you to do that. And one really cool thing for us when we were in Boston, there was one time when we were about 2.5 years in, and I really needed proof that we were supposed to stay. And so I prayed very specifically. And some people say, oh, now you think God's a genie, right? But God knew the intention of my heart, which was I wanted to be obedient. I wanted to, you know, do what he wanted me to do. So I prayed and I said, because, you know, we were living off raised funds at the time. We were pretty much like missionaries. So, and we were running out of money. So I said, if you want us to stay, I need you to give us $50,000, like to know that we're not supposed to pack up and go back home, but that we're going to stay here and keep going. And he answered that prayer, right? He brought us a donor that gave us $50,000 within like weeks. It was crazy. And I'm not saying like every day we need to have these like very specific prayers. I know there's other stories that have happened at Kingswood. There was one girl like who would pray how many pieces of cereal she should have, you know, every morning. Like, you know, so we can go like really extreme with it as well and be like, okay, if God's real, he's gonna, you know. But that's the thing. My prayer wasn't necessarily, God, if you're real, you know. It was just, I want to know what is the right next step for me and my family, you know. But sometimes it is doubt of his existence. And he's okay with that as well, right? Like we see with Thomas. So I think there's just like an empowerment that happens when we really specifically seek the Lord and we see him at work in our lives. And again, Jesus says, those people will be blessed, you know, that haven't seen me in my physical form, but still believe. And what's really neat is that it reveals, again, two things. One's a reiteration of what I already said, but it shows that Jesus is patient, right? And he's non-anxious, but in order to not be anxious, you have to be patient. Because a lot of the times we're anxious because we're not patient with an outcome or something working out the way that we were hoping it would. But we see that he is patient. And again, we see over and over that his goal is always for us to trust him. John 17:18-19 says, "As you sent me into the world, I have also sent them into the world. I sanctify myself for them, so that they may also be sanctified by the truth. So we've already seen this, right, in John 20, where he says, as the Father has sent me, I send them. And Jesus's goal is trust, right? But Jesus always has like a reason behind it. And trust will need to be, you know, sprinkled into our lives in different times, in different ways, for different reasons. But what he's saying specifically here is, I need them to trust me so that I can send them out into the world, right? Because when we're kind of hunkered down and we just hang out at home and we're not really doing like risky things, like we don't necessarily need the trust that we would need when he says, okay, now I want you to go and do something. And, you know, he says, you know, I'll be with you even to the ends of the age, right? He promises his presence. But if we don't trust him, again, it's easy to trust him when there's not a lot of action. But as soon as he's asking us to do something, then we really need to go back to that trust. And then as we live this out, we become holy like he is holy. Because we want to make sure when we're on mission, right, that there's nothing that's going to be in the way of the best result possible, right? So there's not a lot in life we can control. We certainly can't control outcomes or how people are going to respond, you know, if we try to engage them in some way. But we can kind of control-ish ourselves and how we respond to situations, and how we understand that in order to have Jesus have the most influence on us, and then that influence on us, meaning that we can execute his plans the best, right? We need to be pursuing holiness. We need to be repentant people. We need to be confessional people, right? And so as we do that, we become holy as he is holy. Because Jesus was the great high priest, right? And he could take on the sin of the world because he was sinless. Now, of course, we're not sinless, but our mission, in order to do our mission, we do need to be as holy as we can be. So it's this kind of like dance between, I want to be active in serving the Lord, but in order to do that, I need to be holy. But then as I grow in holiness, then my desires will align with God's desires, and I'll want to do the things he's asking me to do. So it's kind of like this, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But it is both, right? As he is making us holy in him, then he's going to say, okay, now I want you to do this. And then you go do that. And you're like, whew, thank God I have God, or I would never have been able to do that. And then you go back and you kind of recoup, and then he's got the next thing, right? So like, it's this, we're not being holy just for holiness sake, right? We're being holy as he is holy so that we can be on mission for him. And ambassadors, right? So every week we do the same benediction. Does anybody have it memorized yet? Yeah. But we go as ambassadors for Christ, right? So we talked about this a couple weeks ago when I preached from it. Ambassadors show allegiance to their king, right? So if we need to show allegiance to a king, we need to trust that king. We need to trust who we're going out to represent, right? And if we don't, then when we have some resistance or pushback, it could cause us to go into a spiral. Like, oh, you know, like I told somebody about Jesus and then they had this argument against him, and are they right? You know? And so that's we need to be confident in who we're serving so that we can go out confidently. And again, that doesn't always mean that when we share Jesus to the world that they're going to accept him. And if they don't accept him, it doesn't mean that we're not doing something right. It just means they have free will, right? And the choice. But that doesn't give us the pass to not go and represent our king, right? Like, and again, we all do that different ways because we have different base gifts, we have different spiritual gifts. But to do it in a way that brings life and joy, I think requires trust, right? Because if not, then the whole time it's like, oh, do I believe what I'm trying to sell? But that's why I think sometimes too, we have to be patient with people as they work out their salvation and not, expect them to go out as a representative before they're ready to, right? Because again, Jesus is patient. He waited a week, maybe he can wait a year or 10, but that our role in this is he said, I came to testify to the truth, right? So our role is to seek that truth. Keep seeking, keep seeking. And then he will prove himself trustworthy, and then that will give us what we need to be ambassadors for him. And trust is a tricky business. I'm sure we can all appreciate that there were times where God didn't show up the way we thought he would, right? And then it is like, well, is he trustworthy? But when we stick with him for time, then because God is a mystery and his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, we play catch up to him, right? And we realize why maybe something didn't go the way that we wanted it to because he knew better, right? But we need to have those experiences with him to know that that's the way he operates and works, and that his goal is always for our better. He's never going to put us in a place that is, it may be like when he puts us in the refiner's fire, like there could be some hard times like that where he has to remove something from our life in order so that we can move forward and be holy as he is holy. And that in that time might feel like he's against me. But later on, when I reap what I've sown with him, then I see, okay, I see what he was doing there. It was worth it. Because Scripture says nobody likes discipline at the time, right? But if we keep going in the discipline, it will reap a harvest of righteousness. So we have to, again, take that faith the size of a mustard seed, that truth that's just, maybe sometimes just hanging on. And as long as we put it into Jesus, it will reap the right benefit, right? So we just need to keep going and pursuing him. And Jesus will prove that he's trustworthy, just like he did to Thomas, right? When I read that, I'm like, oh, Thomas should have just believed, But that's not Jesus' attitude, right? So that shouldn't be our attitude either, right? So when people say, I believe, help me with my unbelief, right? Then we should respond to that with patience and not frustration and just say, okay, we're going to pursue this truth together so Jesus will show that he's trustworthy. Corrie ten Boom says, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Let's pray. Jesus, if there are areas in our lives where we're doubting, we're hopefully making a commitment to you today to continue to pursue your truth and you as that truth. We're going to borrow from the faith, the trust that we have from our previous experiences. We're going to bring that into our present ones so that we are giving you the time and the space to prove to us that you are trustworthy. Like the man who said, I believe, I trust, but help me with my unbelief, my untrust. We recognize that trust is not yes or no, but it can be a scale. And it can, today I can say I trust Jesus 7 out of 10, or 2 out of 10, or 10 out of 10. And you'll meet us wherever we are on that scale of trust. Thank you that you are trustworthy, that you're patient. You say when we draw near to you, you'll draw near to us. So thank you for meeting us exactly where we are. And thank you for helping us move to that next step, whatever that means. And that again, with that faith, whether it's the size of the mustard seed or it's the full mustard tree, that will be your representatives, that will align ourselves to you and to your mission. And I'm just thinking too, sometimes it's love our neighbor as ourselves. So maybe part of the mission in a season is just to love ourselves and let you lavish us with love, to heal or to prepare us. Hope is an active thing, and I think trust and hope are so closely intertwined. And so for us here, if we need more hope, Lord, I think we need more trust. And again, all those things are always a dance. That as more trust comes, more hope comes, and as more hope comes, it'll increase the trust. So yeah, again, just meet us where we are. And then help us get to the next right place. I pray this all in your name, Jesus. Amen.